Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scott Jackson. I'm an extension professor at the University of Massachusetts in the Department of Environmental Conservation. I am a wildlife biologist and a wetland scientist, and I got interested in the role of culverts and other road stream crossings and their impact on fish and wildlife over 20 years ago. We developed crossing standards that have been adopted by the Army Corps of Engineers and by Mass DEP in their regulations around wetlands permitting, and then developed an assessment protocol for assessing road stream crossings for their barrier effects on aquatic life, like fish and salamanders and things like that. In 2015, a program that was run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the North Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which covered 13 states in the northeastern U.S. from Virginia and West Virginia, north and east through New England. They were interested in having crossing assessments available and being used throughout that 13-state region. But at the time, there were separate protocols being used in different states. So Maine had their own protocol, so did New Hampshire, so did Vermont. Our Massachusetts protocol had been used in Rhode Island and was being adopted in New York. There's a protocol in Connecticut. And so they offered up funding to bring together people from all those different states to work on a single protocol that could be used throughout the region. And so that eventually became the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative, as a way of developing a programmatic infrastructure to support these assessments, as well as the protocols and a database to house all the information. And so I've led that NAACC project since it began in 2015. And part of my role in that is to do training and to help people get enrolled in the program and certified so that their data can be entered into our database and scored and made more broadly available, as well as included in different landscape modeling exercises that I'll mention a little bit later. So you want me to jump right in?
Yeah, they've gotten some background. I forgot to say the first 7 weeks was kind of more background in identifying the organization and their work. Their next 7 weeks, what they just started yesterday, they're going to be committed full time to working with the collaborative and really diving into this. So we are hopefully getting out into the field next week to start looking at culverts.
Great. It's a lot of fun. And you find a lot of very bizarre and interesting circumstances out there as well. You become detectives after a while. All right, well, this is the protocols training for the NAACC's non-tidal aquatic assessment. And what I'm going to do is go through some basic information about the protocol, the NAACC, how things are set up, and then start working through the field data form pretty much line by line to make sure that all the different terminology and is understood, and to explain some of the conceptual basis for why everything is what's on the form is on the form for a reason. I'll take a break about halfway through so that you can stretch your legs and do anything you need to do in the meantime, and about a 10-minute break, and then we'll wrap up by 3:30. All right, well, so I gave you a little bit of the history of the NAACC, which some also refer to as the NAACC. And essentially our objectives in creating the NAACC was to create a network in the North Atlantic region of people that were interested in landscape scale connectivity. Initially, it was just about aquatic connectivity, but more recently, we've branched into terrestrial connectivity as well. To develop unified stream crossing assessment protocols that can be used throughout the region, and create a programmatic infrastructure to support the collection of road stream crossing data and the use of those data to prioritize crossings for replacement. When I talk about programmatic infrastructure, these are some of the elements, crossing codes, protocols and field data sheets, including electronic data forms that you can use on smartphones and on tablets. There's a fairly sophisticated online database where data are stored and can be retrieved. Data as it's entered is scored so that there's scoring mechanisms that are built in. There's a map interface for interacting with the crossings and also the data within the crossings assessment database, and a data filtering tool, which I'll demonstrate briefly in a little while. There's also a website that was developed by the Nature Conservancy that can be used to prioritize which subwatersheds to target first for crossing assessments. You don't have to use it, but it's available to help in setting priorities for assessment. And then both the Nature Conservancy and UMass Ecological Landscape Lab, Landscape Ecology Lab have models that they use for prioritizing crossings for replacement or upgrade based on the data that are collected by people working in the NAACC. These are the crossing codes that we use. They're really long, but it was the only way we could really easily create a coding system that both made sense and also provided unique codes for every crossing in this 13-state region. It's just simply the GIS, GPS coordinates or GIS coordinates of Latin long mashed together with the XY put in front so that Excel doesn't truncate all the numbers on us. So these are really important because these are standardized in our database and throughout the entire region. Although as you'll see later, you have the opportunity of creating your own ID system and using it in order to make it easier to communicate about a particular region where there's a limited number of crossings. We had an opportunity to invest a significant amount of money in the development of the NAACC, including the database and the electronic data forms and the training and certification systems. But we knew that that money was going to run out eventually, and so we really wanted to create a system that was low cost. And the way that works is what I call distributed coordination. So groups organize themselves. They identify somebody to be their coordinator. They get trained to be lead observers, and the coordinator takes an additional training to be a coordinator. And then, essentially these local coordinators are what we call L1 coordinators. And we also have a number of L2 coordinators that work on a larger regional basis to try to coordinate the work of all the various different groups that are collecting data, say within a state or within a particular watershed. And then L3 coordinators are a handful of people at UMass that are responsible for keeping everything together. And so we have this sort of hierarchy of coordination just to try to make it a little more efficient and to distribute coordination throughout the entire region. So lead observers are the people that actually collect the data, and we call them lead observers because it's permissible to bring people who are not certified in the protocols out with you when you're out collecting data. So as long as there is somebody in charge who has been certified by the NAACC, your data can then be not only collected, but also entered into the database. We recognized when we were developing protocols for the NAACC that there are a lot of different reasons for assessing road stream crossings. Some of them may have to do with the risk of failure, like geomorphic vulnerability or the structural integrity or condition of crossings. There's also an interest in not only aquatic connectivity, but also the ability for terrestrial wildlife to pass through these road stream crossings as well. And rather than create a single protocol that covered everything, we decided to go with a modular approach where we have different modules that people can choose to use, whichever ones are useful to them. The first module that we created was the aquatic connectivity module for non-tidal streams. Essentially, we left out tidal streams because they were a more difficult thing to figure out because of the potential for bidirectional flow and because water levels were fluctuating on a daily basis due to tides. And this is the one that we'll spend most of our time with today, where we'll go through this line by line and go through the data form so that you hopefully will fully understand exactly what information you're collecting when you're out in the field. This is sort of a snapshot that I took recently of the amount of records that have been submitted to the database so far. We're now up over 71,000 records, and we have over 100 coordinators and basically about 500 lead observers that are certified and active in collecting data throughout this 13-state region. Our database also houses data from the other protocols, some of which predate the NAACC, others like the Vermont protocol are still active. And so that accounts for another 40,000 records. And so essentially there's over 100,000 records in the database right now. Eventually, though, we did get around to doing an assessment protocol for tidal crossings or crossings on tidal streams and rivers. And that here's the data sheet and the instruction manual, both of which are available from our website. In working with certain communities in order to do assessments of all the culverts in those communities, we found that some of the highway managers and DPW chiefs would be interested to have us also report back any culverts that were in really bad shape. And so this interest in what was the condition of the culverts, because apparently people there's so many of them, it's hard to get around and inspect them on a regular basis. It led us to create another assessment module for culvert condition. And so this is one that we've created. It's not fully deployed yet because we're still working on the training materials, but this hopefully will be ready in the next couple of months so that it can be used during this field season. And then, as I mentioned, there is some interest in the movement of terrestrial wildlife through the landscape and to focus on how those species will get across roads and highways. And so we've created an assessment, terrestrial connectivity assessment, to assess the barrier effects on road stream crossings on terrestrial wildlife. Actually, it's not so much the barrier effects as much as is it a way to get around the barrier effects of busy roads and highways. So in some cases, these are opportunities more than barriers. So the basic structure of the NAACC is that lead observers will do most of the data collection, although certainly coordinators can also collect data, but they have to be certified lead observers as well. So the role of the observers is to collect the data, and then when it comes to entering data into the database, to make sure that those are matched to the appropriate XY codes, the locations, enter the data into the database. And if you're using paper forms, that means typing it in on a data entry screen. If you're using the electronic data form, you have to match the survey locations to the XY codes, but then otherwise it's an automatic upload of all the data from your smart device. For coordinators, for L1 coordinators, they review and approve all the records. So your record, once it's entered and submitted, goes to the coordinator for a quick review to make sure everything looks okay. We ask coordinators to field audit 10% of a lead observer's first 50 records. So that means 5 out of those first 50 records should be double checked just to make sure that you got it all figured out. But some people have come from other places where they've used other protocols, and if they have a lot of experience with crossings assessment, then they don't need to be audited by the coordinator. As I mentioned before, in order to get access to the database to enter data, you have to be certified in the protocol that you want to work with. So there are 3 different elements to certification for the lead observers. One is what you're going through right now, the non-tidal protocols training. This can be done either in person or via Zoom like we're doing now, or you can do the entire thing online. Once you complete this Zoom-based training, you can go online and take the quiz. So bullet number 1 has to do with passing the quiz. Number 2 is a field training, and that's about a half day's worth of training out in the field so that you get familiar with actually collecting the data, using the equipment. And then shadowing is the 3rd element. And that means going out with somebody who's already certified and doing at least 20 crossing assessments with that certified person, just to make sure you've seen a wide, a significant range of different circumstances and structures so that you know how to approach something that might be a little unusual or something that you've never seen before. For L1 coordinators, they have to be certified as a lead observer and then take a short online coordinator training and pass that quiz. And then they can be ordained as coordinators. So this is the protocol that we're going to focus on today. It's the non-tidal aquatic assessment, and there is the field data form and also the instruction manual. And I highly recommend that you keep a copy of the instruction manual in your car or with you when you're out doing these assessments, in case you run into something unusual or something that is uncommon enough that you may have forgotten exactly how you're supposed to deal with it. The database has rules that are set up in order to try to avoid mistakes, and these are what we call data validation. So they're rules that can't be violated or else you get an error message. They're programmed into the database and include things like required fields to make sure that everything is there that's needed to compute scores. An acceptable range of measurements so that if somehow your fingers slip and you end up with like 5 digits instead of 3, and you end up with an enormously large structure that's miles in size, it will flag it so that you can correct that. GPS units, if you select a crossing that's some distance from where your GPS coordinates are, then you'll get a message about that maybe you weren't where you thought you were, and perhaps go back and verify whether either your GPS unit was malfunctioning or whether you weren't where you thought you were. If you're using electronic data forms, then you'll get these error messages as you enter the data, so you can correct them while you're still at the site. But of course, we can't program paper in the same way. So if you're using paper forms, you won't know about these mistakes until you go to enter the data in the data entry screen. So now we're going to start the process of going through the field data form to go through line by line and make sure you understand exactly what's expected. We begin with terminology, in that the part of the data form is based on information that you collect at the crossing, and part of the information you're collecting is on structures. And so there's a distinction between crossings and structures. And so the way it's defined is that a crossing is a place where one stream crosses one road. And so where those lines intersect, you have a crossing. But at that crossing, you might have more than one structure. So there might be just a single pipe, and that would be a structure at that crossing. You might have twin pipes, you might have 3 pipes, you might have a bridge with multiple cells. And so each bridge cell, each culvert is a separate structure. And so it's important to remember this distinction, because when certain data are based on the crossing, you have to sort of take all of the structures into account. But if it's structure-based information, then you're really doing it separately for each structure that occurs at a crossing. So about 80% of surveys have only one structure at the crossing. So by and large, you're dealing with, a single structure, and the field data form's first page has room for one structure and the overall crossing data. So all you need is one page for 80% of the crossings that are out there. The crossing data is the upper part of page 1. And so all of this here would be assessed at the entire crossing level. The lower part is where you would put data for your structure number 1. And so if you only have one structure, that's essentially all on one page. But there will be places you will visit that have more than one structure, and sometimes many structures. And so an important part of this is knowing how to number the structures so that we can match up the data with the proper culvert. So the way you do that is you look at the inlet for the structure. So with you facing the inlet, with your upstream is to the back of you, you go from left to right, numbering in consecutive order. So looking downstream at the inlet of the structure, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so you would fill out a separate section for each of those crossings. But most of the time you're only dealing with either one structure or 2 or 3 structures. So basically about 98% of crossings have 3 or fewer structures. And so this page is page 2 of the crossing form, and it has room for 2 more structures. So if you photocopy these back to back, page 1 and page 2, then essentially you've got what you need for almost all the structures you're likely to encounter. And then there's extra pages, pages 3, 4, 5, that you can use to add additional structures as needed. So you might want to have a few copies of those pages available for when you need them. But in most cases, a single sheet of paper will cover about 98 to 99% of the crossings. The last page of the field data form is this reference sheet that just shows you the various different shapes of inlets and outlets that you need to record on the data form, the one that matches best what you see in the field. And then it also illustrates where the dimensions are that you need to measure for each of these structures. And for all of the structures except for structure 7, there's essentially 4 dimensions that are required, A, B, C, and D. And for the 7th structure, the number 7 shape, you also have to do an additional dimension, E. So we'll go over that when we get to the structure part of the data form. Any questions so far before I start going into the line by line dissection of this data form? All right, then we'll just keep rolling. All right, so now we're at the top part of the data sheet where we're dealing with crossing data. And a lot of this is sort of basic information, crossing codes, date observed, lead observer, what's the name of the road, what's the name of the stream, what type of road is it, and a place for GPS coordinates and a narrative description of the location. So the crossing code is this code that I showed you before, which is just a concatenation of the latitude and longitude with XY in front of it. So these are the coordinates for that, and that's how that code was created. But when you're at the site, you also want to record the GPS coordinates of where you were. And ideally, you want to be standing in the middle of the road on top of the center line of the stream. But we recognize there are a lot of roads where it would be unwise to do that. So you try to get as close as possible so that the location is as close as possible. When we first started doing this back in the early 2000s, we did some field audits of data that were collected by people who were part of the process. And we found out that about 16% or more of the crossings that were assessed were not where people thought they were. So the locations were mixed up. So we made it a requirement that people use GPS to record GPS coordinates for each record. And at the time we were doing this, GPS units were not common. Now they're pretty much in everybody's phone. So this is a relatively easy thing to do. And then there's a really important mechanism that I'll show you later for how you plug in these GPS coordinates and then use that to identify the appropriate crossing code for your record. All right, so let's see, do anything else to cover there? Just the road type is on there. I didn't really cover this, but multi-lane, paved, unpaved, driveway, trail, railroad. The only one that's at all confusing is multi-lane, because a lot of paved roads are multi-lane roads. So paved, we consider either a single lane or 2-lane road. Multi-lane is more than 2 lanes. So anything that has more than 2 travel lanes, not counting the shoulder. All right, so now we move down on the sheet a little bit, and the next thing we come to is crossing type. And there are a lot of different options to check. And so I'm going to go through these sort of one by one to explain what these mean. Some of them are easy and intuitive, and other ones need some explanation. So we'll begin with a bridge. And so a bridge can be defined differently by different people. And when we began this work, we started saying, well, a bridge is an open bottom structure and a culvert has has a bottom to it, whether it's a concrete bottom or a box culvert, or whether it's a pipe. But engineers don't call bridges, but don't define bridges that way. And so we've gone more towards how the engineers look at this, in that a bridge is a structure that has abutments or piers and a deck that lies on top of that. And that road deck doesn't need to be buried. It can be right just on top of the abutments. Whereas a culvert is a structure that needs to be embedded in soil in order to have structural integrity. So this is an example of a bridge, and this is also an example of a bridge. And arches are one of the hardest things to try to figure out, because some of these are clearly bridges, even though they're arched. But there's also open bottom arches that are more like culverts that have to be packed in with substrate all around them in order to maintain their shape. So it doesn't matter a ton whether you call them bridges or culverts, but just try to remember that essentially there's no fill on top of a bridge, whereas there is fill on top of a culvert. So culvert is next. So this includes things like pipes and arches. This is, or what sometimes referred to as squash pipes or pipe arches. There's box culverts, and there's open bottom arches. Now, some of those arches might well be bridges and there's no fill on top, but some of them are aluminum arches that require fill in order to maintain the shape and integrity. So just keep that in mind when you try to decide whether to call it a bridge or a culvert. Then you have multiple culverts. And so if it's a multiple culvert crossing, that means there's more than one structure there. So it can be, twin pipes or twin boxes. Sometimes you're in a situation where you have culverts set at different elevations, and that's because most of the water is going to go through the bigger ones that are set at lower elevation, but they included additional culverts for flood relief when you have high water periods. And it can be sometimes a question in the field as to whether to assess those flood relief culverts or not. And I recommend that they be assessed so that anybody who comes, 5 or 10 years later to double check to see if anything's changed, if they see 4 but you only assess 2, they might be a little confused about whether those data are for the same site or not. Now, one of the problems is that when these structures get scored, basically when the crossing gets scored, each structure is individually scored, and then the best scoring structure determines the crossing score. And so you'd hate to be in a situation where one of your best scoring structures was one of the flood relief culverts, because most of the time no water is going through those. So there is when we start talking about physical barriers, one category of physical barrier is dry. And so that means that even though there's water in the stream, the culvert is not holding any water. And that is one way of sort of knocking down the score for these flood relief culverts to make sure that they don't trump whatever's actually carrying most of the water. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but I'll take the opportunity to mention now is that we would like you to do these assessments at typical low flow conditions. So it's better to be out there when the water's not raging for safety purposes, but also it's harder to see what's there if the water is deep or if it's turbulent. And so if you're trying to figure out if there's substrate in the pipe or if there's an outlet drop or any number of other things that you need to record, it may be difficult under high water conditions. And so it's better to do it under low water, not necessarily drought conditions, because then it's hard to assess water depth and velocity. But typical low flow is what we're aiming for. I like to throw this in just because I really like this crossing as a multiple structure crossing. You've got a pipe over here on the left, you've got a box in the middle, and you've got an arch on the right. So they went with the basic menu of options and decided to take one from each category and put it in there. All right, moving on. Next crossing type is a ford, and a ford is a place where there is where the traffic actually drives through the stream itself. And so it doesn't pass water under the road. It allows you to drive on the road through the water to the other side. And so it's not exactly a structure, even though we do collect data in the structure component of the field data form, but it's still important because in GIS, you will often have a road and a stream and they intersect, and we really want to know what's going on at that intersection, even if it's not a barrier of any kind. Yeah, the one on the left is not much of a barrier, although, people sometimes lay down stones for better traction and for a better substrate to drive on. But other fords, like the one on the right, are really reinforced and have a concrete element to them. And what looks like it probably has an outlet drop on the far side. So it's really important to collect data on those characteristics of a ford so that we can identify them when they're barriers. Next one is a removed crossing. And a removed crossing is a crossing that used to exist but no longer exists, probably because it washed out. Generally, we don't voluntarily pull out crossings, but sometimes when they fail, they don't get replaced. This is an example that I saw in Vermont, where you've got an old cart path through the woods that's long abandoned, yet there was still a culverted crossing there for a period of time, and then eventually that crossing washed out. So this would be an example of a removed crossing. We still want you to assess it because sometimes what's remaining might create a barrier to fish or other organism passage. So you might still have, some kind of a foundation in there or other structures that could impede the movement of fish. This is a more typical looking situation where you have a road that washed out, but they've decided not to replace it. Next is no crossing. And so you'd think, well, isn't no crossing the same thing as a removed crossing? And the answer is no. We mean something different by no crossing. No crossing is when you have lines in GIS that show an intersection between roads and streams, but it doesn't actually exist. So often on small roads and small streams, you have a lot of forest cover in Massachusetts. You can't always see exactly where the stream is relative to the road. And so photo interpreters will sometimes draw the stream crossing the road multiple times, and some of those crossings may not actually happen. And so this is to identify artifacts of GIS where there are mistakenly identified a crossing at a location where there actually is no crossing. So all you have to do when you check off this is check it off, and then you don't have to collect any other data. Next one is the buried stream or inaccessible. A buried stream is when you actually have a portion of what's generally a more developed part of the world where the stream has been piped underneath the land use. So it doesn't just cross the road, but sometimes you basically put the stream into a pipe and you run it through the downtown, or you run it through an industrial park. So when you run into that, it's really hard to collect all the data necessary for a crossing assessment, because sometimes you might be at the inlet or you might be at the outlet, but you have no idea where the other end of the pipe is. Also, sometimes you're like in the middle. Amherst actually has a crossing sign for a brook, and every time I drive by it, I keep looking for the brook and I can't find the brook. And then I asked somebody about it and they said, oh yeah, it's underground. We just put up that sign as a sort of memorial to the brook that used to be there. So, there are places where the line might actually cross a road, but you have no way of assessing it because it's buried underground.
And
So
this
there
is
you
why
can,
we're not doing our assessments in Worcester, because most of them are underground.
right. So you can just check these off and then you don't have to really collect any data, or you can collect as much data. Like if you're at the inlet, you can collect all the inlet information, but you don't have to collect anything more than that. Inaccessible means that you can't get there. Sometimes it may be because it's private property and it's posted. Sometimes that private property means it's also unsafe to go off the road right of way. In other cases, it may just be physically very difficult or impossible to get there. Maybe the road is closed, or maybe, it could be that it's closed in the wintertime and you got to wait for spring in order to go back, something like that. But by checking off inaccessible, it means that somebody else that's looking and sees a dot on the map that doesn't have a score, they can go to the database and find out why. That basically it's hard to get to that site, or it wasn't overlooked. There was a reason why data were not collected there. All right, next is partially inaccessible. And this is a little different than inaccessible. Partially inaccessible means you can get to the crossing, and you might even be able to collect some of the data, but you can't collect all of it. So maybe you can get down to the inlet, but you can't get down to the outlet, either because it's private property or it's unsafe or just physically very difficult to get down there. So you can check this off, and this is what I just said, but you can enter data, but the validation rules will be relaxed so that you can leave some blank fields where you don't have information. If you can make a reasonable estimate of what's on the other side, you can go ahead and do that. So like if you can get to the inlet, but you can't get to the outlet, and you can see all the way through it, and you can see that it's a single round pipe on both sides, and that they have the same dimensions, you can use the dimensions from the inlet side to determine what the dimensions would be at the outlet side. So we encourage you to, if you can't take measurements, then estimate. If you can't estimate, then you can check off partially inaccessible. But collect as much data as you can while you're out there, because some data is better than no data. And just remember that inaccessible is reserved for crossings that can't be assessed at all. And partially inaccessible is when you can collect some data, but not all. Another option that we ended up adding for the NAACC based on field experience is no upstream channel. And so this is a situation where there's a culvert on the road, but it's really a passage to nowhere. And this could be at the headwater, right at the origin of a stream, where essentially water seeping out of ground, passing under a road, and then becomes an intermittent stream that eventually becomes a perennial stream further down gradient. It can be a wetland crossing where you've got wetlands on both sides of the road and no actual channel, just wetland and water crossing under the road. Here again, if you check this option, you're allowed to enter data, but the validation rules are relaxed. Here are a couple of examples of when you might use it or when you might not use that option. So here's a situation where you essentially got a headwater wetland on one side of the road and then a stream on the other side. And even though there may be some small channels in the wetland, they don't go anywhere. So essentially there's no good reason why a fish wants to get up across this road. And so in this case, you can call that no upstream channel and check it off. You can collect data or you can just pass it on. Here's a different situation where a stream that flows into a wetland becomes very diffuse in the wetland, and you can't really see the main channel. There may be evidence of some partial channels, or maybe the water flows right through the vegetation, but then it goes through the culvert and becomes a stream again on the other side. In this case, we suggest that you call it a culvert and that you assess it like a culvert, because during higher water periods, there's going to be enough water in the wetland that a fish could go through the culvert, through the wetland, and upstream beyond. So if there's some place to go on the other side of the wetland, in other words, a channel on the other side of the wetland, don't use no upstream crossing, but treat it as a typical crossing. All right, and I think this is the last one for crossing type, is called bridge adequate. And essentially, this is for major bridges where there's no doubt about passability. And in some cases, it would be really difficult to get all of the measurements that you need if it's crossing, the Blackstone River or something like the Connecticut River. It's sort of a foolish waste of time to try to collect all the data when it's clear that it's passable. So it's okay to bypass those crossings without collecting data. Just check off bridge adequate and record the location, and we will assume that it's passable in the database. You can enter data, but you don't have to enter all data. So if you want to add some information about the crossing, you're welcome to do that. So here are a couple of examples of things that I would probably categorize as bridge adequate. That essentially it's not, the bridge itself is not creating any impediment to aquatic organisms going through. All right, next up on the form is a box for the number of culverts and bridge cells. So essentially it's one for most of them, but if you have multiple culverts or multiple cells, put the total number in this area of the form. So this would be a 2, and this would be 2 different bridge cells. Some people have asked, they say, now, what if it's like a wooden structure and you know, it's essentially piers, but it's not really obvious cells. So, do I call them separate cells or is it all one cell? And the way that I answer that question is that if once a fish goes in one side, it has to either finish going through that cell or come back out and go in the other side. Those are separate cells. If it's like a wooden infrastructure where they can get into the cell, cross under through the wooden infrastructure and go out the other cell, then that's all one cell that just happens to have a wooden infrastructure element inside, what we would call um, internal structures that we'll talk about later. So essentially a cell is so that we can independently identify and score each opportunity that a fish has for trying to get across that road. And if they're separate, then we score them separately. And if they're all just part of one, we treat it as one. All right, there's a box on here for culvert condition. This is really just meant to provide people with some information about whether that structure is likely to be replaced anytime soon. So you can say that it's okay, because we didn't want people trying to figure out whether it was good or fair or moderate. It's either okay or it's in rough shape. So rough shape is poor. So it's okay or it's poor. We want you to indicate if it's brand new, because that can sometimes be used for research to see if people are actually using the crossing standards when they replace crossings. So the Division of Ecological Restoration expressed interest in having this as an option so that they could do that kind of research. And then unknown is there. Sometimes, the structure is submerged and you can't really tell what kind of shape it's in. So this would be an example of something we would call poor because it's rusting out on the bottom. And this one is poor also. The picture doesn't do it justice, but this was a culvert on the Mass Pike where it's essentially completely crushed and you can't see through this crossing at all. And I remember when I visited this with a DOT crew and somebody from DEP, we looked at this thing and the DOT person said, "That's it, I'm not driving this stretch of highway till they fix that." So it just goes to show that these are not inspected all that often. And so even just a little bit of information that you can collect on this data form might be enough to draw some attention and get people out there to take a closer look. Another one that is related to structure failure is alignment. And alignment is something that we assess only on the inlet side. We don't care what happens at the outlet. But at the inlet, a skewed alignment may result in woody debris becoming plastered up against the structure and blocking it. And that can be a cause of failure. So essentially what you're doing is you're sort of looking at the center line of the culvert, and then you're looking at the alignment of the stream in about the 30-foot area approaching the culvert. And so what's happening up here doesn't matter as much as what's happening close to the culvert inlet. And if this angle is less than 45 degrees, then it's good enough. We call it flow aligned. If that angle is greater than 45 degrees, we call that skewed. And it's important that this is relative to the culvert, not the road. So when you have a culvert that's angled, you're looking at sort of drawing a line from the middle of the inlet to the middle of the outlet and then extending that line upstream and then looking at the approach of the stream relative to that center line. So your options here are flow aligned or skewed, and 45-degree angle is what we use to distinguish between those two options. Road fill height is, how much fill is on top of the structure or the crossing. So if there are multiple structures, there's usually a similar amount of road fill height, but use an average if you need to, if there's multiple structures. But this is really meant just to get an idea of how expensive will it be to replace the crossing. If you've only got 2 or 3 feet of fill on top of the culvert, that's easy to deal with. I saw a crossing in New Hampshire where there was something like 40 feet of fill on top of a culvert that was in the bottom of a valley. They must have had a burrow pit rail nearby because they just buried the whole thing. So, sometimes this can be challenging to figure out how to get to a place where you can see or measure what the road fill height is. You don't have to get it exact. We just want you to be in the ballpark of how much fill there is. If you were to say that there's 3.5 feet instead of 4 feet, I don't think it makes any difference to somebody who's trying to figure out whether this is going to be cost effective to replace. So just do the best you can, but don't agonize over it. All right, the next one is something that's really important, but sometimes hard to measure. It's called bankful width of the stream. And bankful width is essentially the width of the stream at bankful elevation. Bankful elevation is that elevation where water would leave the stream channel and enter the floodplain. So essentially, this is what's confined within the channel banks. And that's why it's called bankful width. And it takes some experience to try to measure or estimate what bankful width would be. And in some, especially urban areas, it can be really difficult because of the changes that occur in an urban watershed. So it's not essential that you do this. This is an optional thing, but it's still really important to do if you can. And if you're really not sure that you did it correctly or that you just don't know how to interpret, and even expert people struggle in certain circumstances, you can just check off your competence level as low. In some cases it's really clear and you can check off high. And so feel free to use this as a way of sort of qualifying your guess.
And just to say that we'll go through that in person and it will make a lot more sense when you see your defined stream channels versus those that are far more wetlandy and it's challenging to do. And we'll talk about it in person as well, but we'll be taking those measurements further up and further down from where the actual crossing is, not directly at the crossing itself. So
Right.
Scott always has that fun job in person where he's like, I'm going to go find the bankful width, guys. I'll come back to you and see what your questions are later. And if you find out, 100 feet up, you've got another culvert. Well, you're going to have really low confidence because that culvert, upstream is already creating a restriction there and not giving you an accurate, what if we weren't here kind of bankful width. So Heather probably has more experience in that with wetland stuff, but it'll make more sense in person.
Absolutely. And those are all really good points. And one other that I would add is that if you then start walking upstream to try to get away from the influence of that culvert and the stream forks, you don't go above a confluence or you don't go below a confluence if you're going downstream because the volume of water is different and the bankful width is going to change accordingly. All right, next up, and we're getting to the end of the crossing part of the data form, but next up is constriction. And so this is how much does the crossing constrict the flow of water. So what you're really doing is looking at the width of the stream and the width of the crossing and comparing. And so there are a couple of ways that you can do this. The best way to do it is to use bankful width and compare it to the maximum width of the crossing. So here you can see bankful width is much more than the active width of the stream, and in many cases, especially at low flow, is going to be wider than the wetted width. But if you're really insecure about doing bankful width, you can do wetted width of the stream and then use the wetted width of the culvert. And if it's a single structure, you can just do the wetted width of that one culvert. If there's multiple culverts, you have to add the widths together. So the wetted width of culvert 1 plus the added width of wetted width culvert number 2. and you compare that with the wetted width of the stream. But as I said, I prefer to do bank full width and compare the full width of the structure or the combined width of multiple structures that you might have. And if that ratio, if the structure width is 50% or less of the bank full width, we consider that a severe constriction. If it's between 50 and 100%, we consider that a moderate constriction. And then the next options are if it just spans bank full width or the active channel, whichever you're using as a reference, or it's even bigger than that, and it spans both the channel and the channel banks. There are many bridges that do this, not many culverts, but more and more culverts are being built to span the bank full width of the structure. So these are the options that you'll check off. Most of the time, it'll be either severe or moderate. But for bridges, you might use some of these other two, one of these other two options. And then scour pool, the tailwater scour pool. Tailwater is what's coming out of the pipe on the downstream end. And because of the constrictions that they cause, these pipes often have very high velocities, water going through them, which causes a scour when they actually exit the pipe. And so this is called the tailwater scour pool. And we basically just record whether there's no scour pool, whether it's a small pool or a large pool. So to illustrate, here's a crossing where you can see the inlet gives you an idea of the natural width of the channel and the depth of the water as it goes into the pipes. And then at the outlet, you can see that there's this enormous scour pool that's developed. And so you have this very wide pool that's actually quite deep. And so if the pool exists and is wider than the natural channel or deeper than the natural channel, then that's a scour pool. And the question is, well, how do I know when it's large enough to be large? And essentially, if it's twice as deep as what you normally see in the channel itself, or twice as wide as the bank full width of the channel, we consider that a large scour pool. And basically, you can't really assess this separately for each structure, so we do it for the entire crossing because it's really the combined force of both of those pipes that's creating one scour pool. Scour pool and constriction both are ways to try to assess what kind of conditions are being experienced at higher flows. So if you're out there at typical low flow, you might see that the water going through the culvert doesn't have higher velocity than what you're seeing in the stream itself. But at higher flows, it's going to constrict the flow, and you're going to see higher velocities in the pipe than you get in the stream itself. But we don't do the assessment at high flows. So instead, we use indirect indicators to give us an idea of when it's likely to have velocity problems at high flow. And so constriction is one of those, and the tailwater scour pool is another. And later, when we talk about structure, data for each structure, we'll talk about substrate. So the presence or absence of substrate is another indicator of high velocity, as well as armoring. So if essentially they've rip-wrapped the outlet because they know it's going to cause scour, you may not see a scour pool, but you'll see the armoring, which essentially gives you the same message.
And just as a reminder of one of those in-person important things of, we'll be using a lot of measuring tools, and you want to be really careful on the downside of a culvert, because if there is a scour pool, you might be walking in 3-inch deep water, and then all of a sudden you're soaking your boots and you're in 3 feet. So being really careful on those downsides in particular, to take that stadia rod and poke and see, how deep it's going to get before you get there, because it can come up really suddenly and you can lose your boots or just fall over and get submerged.
Yeah. And sometimes there's both rip-wrap and a scour pool. And so in the deeper water, you may not see these large rocks that can easily trip you up and make you to fall over. And then the last thing that we're going to cover on the crossing part of the form is photographs. So we ask you to take 4 photographs at a minimum, but you can take it more than 4 and upload additional photographs if it's useful for illustrating something that you're seeing at a site. So we want a picture of the inlet, a picture of the outlet. We want a picture of the upstream and the downstream portion of the stream. And Alex Abbott, who helped create this slideshow and helped create this assessment protocol with me, spends a lot of time in his trainings showing pictures and saying, I like this one, I don't like this one could be better, this isn't bad. I sort of spare you the photo by photo dissections, but it is really important because people who are doing prioritization, who are doing assessments, who are actually planning to spend money to do replacements, they want to look at the pictures and they want to see that the data tells them some things, but they want to actually see stuff. So good pictures are really important. And so here are the 4 different options that we're looking for. At the road looking upstream, over here is at the road looking downstream, a photo of the inlet, a photo of the outlet. Now this outlet picture is particularly good because it's framed in a way where you can see context. You can see the outlet drop. You can see a little bit of the scour pool or what might be a scour pool. You can see that it's starting to rust through in places. And it's a straight on shot. This one, it's not a straight on shot, but it would be better if it was. So you can sometimes see through the pipe. Sometimes you can see into the pipe. You can get an idea of water depth. But sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes it's just, you just can't negotiate into the muck and the mire to get a head-on shot. So you just do the best you can, recognizing that you want to try to have some context and you want to try to see the bottom of the pipe in all cases that it's possible. And these are some of the reasons why we want pictures, because here's what upstream looks like. Oh, look, there's like a dam and there's water flowing over the road. So we have another barrier directly above where we're doing our assessment. Downstream, it's a wetland. It's a channel through a wetland. And then you can see the inlet and outlet here. All right, so we just finished doing the top part of the form, which is all about the crossing. And next we're going to move on to assessing the structure, at least the first structure. And it's the same for every other structure as well, but we'll be using basically one structure crossings for the most part. So this is a good place to take a break. We've been an hour into it so far. We maybe have another hour to go. So let me just stop to see if there are any questions before we break. So what do you think? Any questions? Comments?
Even for me, I know this and it's still always helpful to hear it again and I always write down notes every time. So I appreciate you taking the time.
I wrote down a note when you had showed the pictures of different culverts. There was one that was, I think it was the arc maybe, and it I couldn't tell, like, do they have to have a structure on the bottom or can it be just like the natural stream bed?
Right, it could be either.
Okay.
So you can have an open bottom arch where they, put footings in the ground and then they create the arch over the stream. So essentially what they end up doing is dewatering the stream, digging down in order to put footings below the frost line where they're going to stay put. And then they build the stream bed while it's dry. And then they put this arch over it. Could be a concrete arch or it could be an aluminum arch. And then they then restore the water back to the stream bed. And that way you can actually have a natural stream bed. But in other cases, you can take a large culvert and countersink it to embed it in the ground and
Okay.
fill it with material. And sometimes you can't tell which is which from, it can be really hard to tell whether it's an open bottom structure or whether it's an embedded culvert. If it's done correctly, it can work just as well. But in general, most people around here don't have a lot of experience in building these things. And so we recommend the open bottom structures whenever they can do it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, let's take a break until 2:15. So that's about a 10-minute break, and then we'll start up again and we'll move through the rest of the form. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the data are used, about how you identify the crossing code that you need to when you put the information into the database, et cetera. All right, so I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Anybody think up any good questions while we were away? Let's see. So are you seeing the data? Are you seeing the data form again? All right, so let's get started again. So now we're going to talk about the structure data collection, the lower part of form page 1. And we start at the beginning or at the top of that section. And the first thing that we get to is, stream structure material. And at some point, we will try to make it possible to check more than one option. But right now, you can only check one of these options. So you pick the one that's most representative of the structure that you're assessing. And if you have a mixture of materials, like maybe it's a metal pipe encased in concrete, or if it's a metal pipe with a concrete bottom, I would say whatever is most touching the water, so you can pick from among these different options, whatever you think is most appropriate. Then record the outlet shape. So we start at the outlet, because if you start at the inlet, you're going to stir up all the sediment and create turbidity. And then when you go to the other side, you won't be able to see things as well. So you pick which of these 7 shapes best illustrates, or approximates the outlet shape, or the shape of the opening at the outlet. Not necessarily the shape of the structure, but the shape of the opening. So just pick the number, but you also could pick a ford if there is no structure, or unknown if you can't tell, or if it's a removed crossing, you can pick removed because there's nothing there to see anymore. Then you measure dimensions. And so basically for all of these different structure shapes, the A dimension is width, the B dimension is height, the D is the depth of water at the outlet, and the C dimension is either the substrate width or the wetted width within the structure, whichever is wider. And it could even be a combination where you might have water on one side and sediment on the other side. It's what we have to subtract out of the cross-sectional area of the structure in order to get the actual area of the opening. So when we calculate an openness factor for structure, we're only looking at what's not filled with water or substrate. So we have to be able to subtract out how much water and substrate is in the pipe or in the box. Then assess whether there is what the outlet grade is. And so essentially this has to do with an outlet drop, or to the degree to which the culvert is perched above the stream channel on the outlet side. And so these are the various different options that you can check off. So this one here, where we're looking at the water, it flows out without any kind of a drop at all. This is at grade. So even though there may be a little bit of a perch here, it doesn't affect the way water flows. So this is at grade. If it falls vertically from the pipe into the receiving pool, that's a free fall. If instead it cascades along either rocks or pavement or concrete, that's a cascade. And in some cases, you have a combination where you had a free fall that then hits the rocks and then cascades until it goes into the receiving pool. So pick which either of these is the best match for what you're looking at. And then there's an option here for clogged, collapsed, and submerged, where the outlet, you just can't tell what's going on there because it's either submerged underwater, or it's clogged with debris, or it's collapsed and crushed. So here's an example of a free fall, right directly into the receiving pool. And this is another one where it would be a free fall. This one could be termed a cascade, I mean, a free fall onto a cascade. And the reason why you might pick that is that this becomes useful. This doesn't really get incorporated into the score, but it's useful information for people that are interested in particular species. So if you're thinking about brook trout and their ability to get through a culvert, they can leap pretty well, and they can jump into a culvert even though there's an outlet drop. But they need to have a pool underneath it that's deep enough so that they can orient their bodies vertically and swim up and be able to get vertically up into the pipe. And if you have a cascade, it's really hard for them to make this leap because they have to leap from back here, and then they've got to go not just vertically but horizontally in order to get in the pipe. So if there's a cascade or a free fall onto cascade, it means that the conditions are not so great for brook trout who are leapers. On the other hand, if you're an American eel, you're going to be able to go squirm right up a cascade, but they can't leap. So even a small drop in some cases might be an absolute barrier. But in some cases, they may be able to wriggle up around the edges. But in this case, a free fall onto a cascade is bad for both. It's bad for brook trout and it's bad for eels. And then this is a situation that you have to use some judgment for. This is where there's a bit of an apron. In this case, it's an asphalt apron that was put in to armor the outlet and essentially created the scour at the end of the asphalt. And so basically this is where you've got a free fall, but it's not really at the outlet of the pipe or of the culverts. And sometimes you end up with a little bit of a free fall at the outlet, and then you get a bigger one at the end of the armoring or at the end of the apron. And so people will say, well, what should I call the outlet drop? Is it this, or is it the one that's up here right at the outlet? And just because I know the quirks of how the scoring system works, I'm going to tell you that whichever one is worse, call that the outlet drop, because the outlet drop has more influence on the score than a physical barrier does. And you can only have one outlet drop estimate, even though you may have two things that are impeding the upstream movement of a fish. And so there's this drop, and then there's the other drop. You take the more severe obstacle and you call it the outlet drop, and then the other thing you call a physical barrier. So as we'll talk about when we get to physical barrier, you don't include outlet drops in the category of physical barriers because outlet drops are separately assessed. But if you end up with two outlet drops, you can call one of them a physical barrier and the other one an outlet drop. So when it comes to measuring the outlet drop, there are two different ways that you can measure. There are two different ways that you should measure. One of them is used in the scoring algorithm, and the other one is available for people who want to create their own scoring systems. So for a free fall, it's from the bottom of the pipe to the top of the water in the pool, in the receiving pool. So this is outlet drop to the water surface. So for a cascade, same thing. It's from the bottom of the pipe to the surface of the pool. So you got to go all the way away from the pipe until you get to the receiving pool, and that's where you estimate this height. And same thing for the free fall onto cascade. You're not measuring it here, you're measuring it down here where it actually is a pool. The other thing that we want you to measure is the outlet drop to stream bottom. And so in this case, the first one, which we called at grade, actually does have an outlet drop when you're measuring it to the stream bottom. So bottom of pipe to stream bottom, there's a little bit of an outlet drop. And we include that because, you know, you're out there, you may be at typical low flow or you may be at moderate flow conditions. It may be that this does cause an outlet drop at lower flows when the water level is low. But more likely is there could be a log jam downstream, just downstream of the culvert, or a beaver dam or something like that that's backing water up into the culvert. And so if the culvert is backwatered, then even though that might ordinarily have an outlet drop, you won't see it when you're out there doing your assessment. But if that logjam finally breaks up and is swept away by higher waters, then the elevation next year might actually be lower and there might actually be an outlet drop there. So this measurement just sort of gives you an opportunity to look for the potential that there may be outlet drops at other times, even though they're not visible when the assessment was done. So this then shows, where you would measure that distance in these other scenarios for the free fall, cascade, and free fall onto cascade. And then, as I mentioned, there's also the option to check off clogged, collapsed, or submerged when you're in a situation where you just can't tell what's going on at the outlet because it's buried or it's collapsed or somehow it's underwater and you just can't see it. And then one other dimension that you're going to measure is the L dimension for length. So you're going to do A, B, C, D, sometimes E, but then you're going to do length. And length is measured in a straight line distance from the inlet to the outlet, the midpoint of the inlet to the midpoint of the outlet. Now, sometimes, especially for bridges, you might actually have a meandering channel under the bridge. But we're not going to measure the actual channel at the thalweg. We're just going to measure the straight line distance from inlet to outlet. And when you're dealing with a situation where you may have a miter cut structure, so a miter to slope is when they cut the pipe at an angle so that it matches the embankment. And in that case, you've got certain distance at the top of the pipe, but the bottom of the pipe is longer than the top of the pipe. So people often ask, well, how do I measure it? From the bottom here to the bottom here, or do I measure it at the top? And the answer is measure it at the top. Essentially, we're doing the length as a way of factoring in that openness factor that we calculate, that the computer calculates for us. And it's essentially cross-sectional area of the opening divided by the length of the culvert. And it's the sense of openness is really the confinement you get when you're in the pipe. And once you can see the sky after you come out of the pipe, you're now opened up. It's no longer an enclosed place. So that's why we do the top of the pipe. Another thing that we want you to assess is whether the stream channel is armored just below the outlet. And so this outlet armoring has to be in the stream channel, not the banks. So we don't care about what's happening up here on the banks or up on the embankment. We want to know whether they actually armored the stream bed, because that tells us this may be just trying to stabilize the banks from the construction. But if they armored the stream bed, usually that means they're expecting scour. And so you may be in a situation where, yeah, you're dealing with high velocities at higher flows, but you won't find the scour pool because of the armoring. And so the armoring might be riprap, like it is in this case. Sometimes it's a concrete apron, sometimes it's asphalt, sometimes it's a plastic apron. They're all different kinds of things. The key thing is to think to yourself, did they do this intentionally to prevent scour? If that's the case, then we're calling it armoring. So when you get into these ambiguous situations where you see scattering of rocks, sometimes it's stuff that's fallen off the embankment, sometimes it's fallen in from the banks. You have to just ask yourself, is this what they did intentionally to prevent scour? And if there is no armoring, you check none. If there is armoring, then it's either extensive or not extensive. And the way that we evaluate that is maybe more complicated than it should be, but essentially what you do is you look at how much armoring there is along the length of the stream. So for here, it starts right at the outlet and it's armored all the way down here. You measure that distance. If that distance is half the bankful width of the stream or greater, then we consider that armoring to be extensive. So if the bankful width is 12 feet, then anything over 6 feet in this direction along the length of the stream would be extensive armoring. All right, so now we're moving from the outlet to the inlet, and we're going to do inlet shape in the same way that we did for the outlet. You're going to pick one of those 7 shapes, and you're going to do the dimensions in exactly the same way. At the inlet, you're also going to look to fill out the inlet type. And so the inlet, if for a culvert in particular, can be projecting. There can be a head wall or wing walls, or a head wall and wing walls. It can be mitered to slope, as I mentioned before. And then you have an option for other or none. So none means basically it's flush and there's no projection at all. So illustrations, this is projecting. It's sort of poking out of the embankment. This is a head wall. This is wing walls. This is head wall and wing walls. And this is mitered to slope, where it's cut at an angle to match the slope of the embankment. All right, now we're going to do inlet grade, and this is essentially like the outlet grade, except that the range of possibilities is much smaller at the inlet. This is at grade, which means the water is not dropping down or climbing up to get into the pipe. This is an inlet drop. Sometimes they're subtle, like this one, but essentially the water's dropping into the pipe. This is a more dramatic one where there's a blockage at the inlet and it's creating an inlet drop. And then this is perched, and perched is an unusual situation, usually only happens in small streams with small culverts, or culverts that are so compromised that the water no longer flows through the culvert, but is flowing around or under the culvert. And so that's what we would call a perched culvert. And then you have the option for clogged, collapsed, and submerged as well. Moving down on the form, there's an opportunity to estimate or measure slope of the culvert or the bridge. This is optional, and it has a confidence value, high confidence, low confidence. We used to try to do this as part of Massachusetts program, but we found that it's very hard without the proper equipment and the proper training to get an accurate measurement of slope. Usually they're pretty flat for the most part, and there's usually very little slope. But in other places where they're trying to estimate hydraulic capacity, they want to know what the slope of the culvert is to plug into the formulas that they're using for that calculation. There's 3 questions related to substrate. So the first one is, what type of substrate is in there? Is it comparable to what's in the stream channel, or is it different? So first option is always none. And there are a lot of culverts out there that have no substrate in them to speak of. If what's in the culvert is comparable to what's in the stream itself, then you can check comparable. If it contrasts with what's in the stream, you pick contrasting. So for example, if it's a sand-bedded stream and then the culvert is full of rocks, that's a contrasting substrate. It's basically organisms that are used to moving through sand are going to have a harder time when they hit a band of rocks. Not appropriate is for things like large angular riprap or construction debris or some other material that they put in there that really shouldn't be. The next question is substrate type. And here again, you can only pick one option, but you pick the closest to silt, sand, gravel, cobble, boulder, bedrock, unknown, sometimes like very tannic waters. You can't really see the bottom. And then you have the option for none if there's no substrate in the pipe. And then substrate coverage. How much of the pipe is covered with substrate? And when we say covered with substrate, we don't mean just a little bit of sediment in the middle of the pipe. We mean that it's basically embedded so that you have substrate pretty much from side to side within the pipe. But even then, sometimes you'll find that at the bottom of the pipe towards the outlet, there may be good coverage, but at the inlet, it's bare. So the question is, how much of that pipe has good coverage versus bare? And you can check off, whichever is the maximum amount. So it's maximum 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%. None and unknown are the other options. And so just one last thing about when we talk about comparable, we need you to use the natural stream channel as a reference for that. And comparable doesn't mean that it matches most of the stream. It just needs to fall within the range of variability of the stream itself. So maybe it's rockier in the culvert than it is in the natural stream, but there are portions of the stream that are just as rocky as what's in the culvert. That would be comparable. It means that organisms that can already get through the stream channel are going to have no extra problem getting through the culvert just because of substrate. Internal structures, these are things like baffles and weirs or supports, like when we talked about bridges where there might be a lattice work of wooden supports. So you can include them here if they occur. So here's an example of weirs that are used to essentially back water up into more of a stepping stones to get through. These are baffles that are meant to back water up, but also reduce velocity. And they come in a lot of different types. This is sort of something that not only slows water down, but also concentrates the flow at low flows so that you have sufficient depth in order for things to be able to get through. So where you have internal structures, just mark them off. Take all different types of internal structures that are there. So on the left here is what we would call sills, where they basically try to put the rocks in a cage so they won't get washed out at high water. I think the theory is that then the fine materials will gather in around the stones. The problem is that if you're worried that these stones are going to get washed out, it's hard to believe that the fine material is likely to stay there. And if those large stones do get washed out, they can create a barrier to movement just by the frames that are left behind. So internal structures, even though you record them on this part of the form, you can also consider them physical barriers if you think that they're functioning as physical barriers for the movement of fish and other aquatic organisms. So that takes us to physical barriers, and that's that part of the form that requires an enormous amount of judgment. And so in the instruction manual, you'll see lots of photographs of different types of physical barriers, and they're organized into different categories. So you have debris, sediment, and rock. You have barrier because the structure is deformed, so deformation. You have free falls that can be at the inlet or somewhere else within the structure, but don't count the outlet. Just count the inlet drop, but not the outlet drop. Fencing can be another one. A lot of times you have trash racks or other kinds of fencing to keep, beavers out, etc. Because it's dry. And I mentioned this before, that if there's water flowing in the stream, but it's not getting through the culvert, then the culvert is a barrier because there's no water in it. So it's not really a very helpful for passability. And then others, and other can be things like anti-beaver devices, a whole variety of weird things that you might see when you're out there. There is this page in the instruction manual which provides some feedback on how to measure how to estimate the severity of different physical barriers. So I generally recommend that people take a copy of it, maybe either laminate it or put it in a plastic sheet and keep it under your clipboard as a ready reference when you're out there in the field and you're trying to figure out how to assess either a single physical barrier or a combination of physical barriers that might be present. And remember, when we talk about physical barriers, we're not going to include outlet drops. Outlet drops are certainly physical barriers, but we already have accounted for them in measuring the free fall or measuring the outlet drops. But if you have an inlet drop or clogging, that can create a barrier. And whenever you're dealing with debris clogs, you have to ask yourself, how long is this going to last? Because if it's very temporary, if it's just a small accumulation of wood and essentially what I like to ask people on during field training is, it's like, okay, if I came back here a year from now, would it still be there? And they'd say, no, probably not. It'd probably wash out at high water. And I said, well, then don't call it a barrier, because you're doing an assessment for that's got to characterize the situation over a period of time and not just at that moment when you're there. But in this case, this is one that I did consider to be a barrier, because in addition to the woody debris, the sediment on the other side of this is risen up almost to the top of where this woody debris is. So that's been there for quite a long time. The actual stream bed on the upstream side has actually risen to this height of the blockage. So this is one that, because it's fairly persistent and it had been around for quite a while, I considered that a barrier. When I first assessed it 10 years ago, when I went back last year, it was gone. So even these barriers don't last forever. So you have to think about whether they last long enough to be worth recording as a barrier. If internal structures represent barriers like this one, make sure you include that as a physical barrier too. The internal structure does not affect the score, but physical barrier does. And so you have to make sure that you account for that. And then again, there's going to be other kinds of barriers. Sometimes they're natural, like beaver dams that are being built inside of a structure. Sometimes they're just really bizarre kinds of structures that are associated with the crossing, and you're not always sure why they did it that way, but it's something you've got to cope with. All right, moving on. Now we're getting down towards the bottom of the form. We're at water depth and water velocity. And for both of these, you're going to use the natural stream channel as your reference point. So does the water depth in the structure match what you see in the stream? Does the water velocity in the structure match what you see in the stream? And so your options are yes, if they're comparable, or for depth, it's no shallower, no deeper, or for velocity, no faster and no slower. You also have the options to check off dry. And in this case, dry means that the stream is dry. It's an intermittent stream and there's no flow. So there's no reasonable way that you can estimate the relative water depths or relative velocities because there's no water. So in that case, you want to check off dry. And just like, and the other really key thing about using the stream as a reference is that there may be sections of the stream, like during riffles, where you've got faster velocity and shallower water depths than you get elsewhere in the stream. You may find that the culvert has similar velocities to the riffles, but the difference might be is that the culvert might be 40 feet long and the riffle might be 8 feet long. So you want to look at velocities and water depth at over a comparable distance. And if you don't see a 40-foot section of stream that's like what you see in the culvert, it's not comparable. You pick one of the other options. And then the last thing was, before we had a terrestrial wildlife module, we wanted to at least collect a little bit of information about how likely it would be for wildlife to use a structure to cross a road. And so the first question is there dry passage through the structure? And dry passage means a way for an animal to get through from inlet to outlet or from outlet to inlet without getting its feet wet. So that's just yes, no, or unknown. And then if there is dry passage, what is the height above dry passage? So what's the headroom available, which will let us know whether a moose can go through there or only a chipmunk. And so when people ask me about this, well, here's just some examples of structures without dry passage. So when there's water completely from side to side, even really large structures sometimes have no dry passage at all. But an intermittent stream will have dry passage if it's dry when you're out there. And also these stream simulation culverts, which we're starting to build more of, have banks on each side, which provide dry passage as well. And so when people ask me, well, are you talking about raccoons? Saying, no, not raccoons. Raccoons wade, they walk right through the water. And I'm not talking about mink. But I am talking about things like opossums, chipmunks, porcupines, chipmunks for really small structures. Porcupines are a good example for others because for an animal that has hollow quills, they're pretty buoyant and they end up floating away if they get into a water current. So even though I've seen woodchucks swim across the Deerfield River, they normally prefer not to get wet. So we're really thinking about not semi-aquatic animals, but more strictly terrestrial species. And then if you have dry passage, you want to estimate what's the distance, what's the headroom above dry passage that might dictate what species can or cannot use that. All right, that's the field data form. Now we're going to cover a few other things. So one is when you want to get information, you can go to our website. We created a portal site for a variety of different stream continuity websites and tools. If you go to streamcontinuity.org/NAACC, you come to our programmatic website. And from that website, you can get access to the data forms and to the instruction manuals, to the scoring documentation, and a whole host of other information. The actual database is hosted on a different server, and so it has a different URL. It's naacc.org. We call this our data center. It includes not just the database, but it also has tools for coordinators that help when you want to upgrade or get somebody certified, or you want to report training requirements, things like that. I mentioned before that data input could be done from paper forms using the data entry screen, or with electronic data collection, you can use bulk uploads where you can upload all of number of records at a time. An important thing to remember about electronic data collection, our electronic form is called an ODM, or an offline data manager, because you don't need to have either cell connection or Wi-Fi connection to use it. It will store information on your phone or on your tablet until you can upload it when you're back to a place where you have connection, where you have connectivity. It doesn't work as well for Apple products as it does for others. So iPads and iPhones are a bit problematic because Apple does not comply with sort of industry standards, and they will only store a certain amount of information in the browser before it starts to overwrite those data. So if you go out and you collect data on your iPhone or your iPad, you want to upload it as soon as you get back before you collect any additional information. If you're going to be out in wilderness areas for days at a time, you better get something other than an Apple product in order to do that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that function that I said before about matching the location of your crossing with an XY code. And so this is the mechanism for doing that. Whether you're using the ODM, the electronic data form, or paper forms, the first step that you want to do is to locate it. So with a paper form, you would then enter data from your GPS coordinates into the data entry screen. So you put in the lat and long, and then you click the View Map button. And when you do that, it's going to pull up a map, and it's going to show you the red star is where your GPS coordinates are from. The black dots are crossings in the vicinity of your red star. And so essentially, you can't always tell from the GPS where those data should be assigned to this crossing on Christian Lane or this crossing that's on Route 5. So what you were going to do then is you're going to put your mouse on the red star and drag it to whichever crossing is the crossing that you assessed. So essentially, you pull it over, you drag it, make sure you're directly over the dot. When you release the mouse, you'll get a message. And this one says, you've successfully selected a crossing code. If you're happy with your choice, please click OK to close the map and return to the data entry form. If not, click cancel and try again. So essentially, you can then click OK. And if you're doing paper entry, it'll bring up the data entry and you're allowed to then enter your data, it will automatically populate the XY code. It'll take it from the database and put it in there so you don't have to type it in. If you're using electronic data collection, all it's going to do is give you one record after another to locate, and then it's going to automatically upload the data into that record. So you don't have to type in anything. You just have to keep dragging the red star onto the appropriate place for each of the records that you're uploading. Now, not all crossings have been mapped ahead of time. There are unmapped roads, there are unmapped streams that you may encounter when you're out and about. And so there is a mechanism by which you can establish a new XY code at the location of a crossing that was previously unmapped. So here's that same position. Here's that same red star. These are the same two black dots, but now you can see a little bit more of the context. And this brook, which is Great Swamp Brook, if you follow it up, it crosses from Route 5, it crosses Christian Lane, it continues behind the Castaway Lounge. And there's this other road here. It's an old farm road that's now an access road for a solar facility. And there's a crossing there. And it's unmapped. There's no black dot there. So if that's the one that you were assessing and your GPS put you here, you're going to need to drag that red star over there and create a new crossing. So there's the crossing that you want to get to. Here's your red star. Drag it over and position it so that that X is directly over the crossing. So sometimes you have to zoom in to make sure you got it directly over the crossing. Then when you release the mouse, you'll get a different message. And this message says, if you were trying to drop your red star onto a crossing, either a black or a green marker, you did not get close enough to the center of the crossing, please click cancel, zoom in, and try again. But then it continues. If you want to add a new XY crossing code to our database at the location of your red star, click OK. And then that will close the map and return you to the data entry form. And so from that location, the database will figure out the X coordinate and the Y coordinate, and it will then create the crossing code. So we're not going to use the GPS coordinates because those are often off by a little bit. But you can use GPS to get in the vicinity and then drag your marker to the exact location, and the XY code will be generated there based on that. All right. This is a duplicate slide. I'm going to zip through. I'm going to eventually take that out. Scoring systems that we have two different scoring systems. One is what we call the course screen, which is just a categories, just puts them into categories based on a limited number of variables that are collected during the assessment. And so for the non-tidal assessment, there are three categories. So AOP stands for aquatic organism passage. And it can either be put in a category where there's no aquatic organism passage, or you have full passage, or something in between, which is reduced passage. But in addition, we also score them numerically on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 is an impassable structure and 1 is fully passable. And this numeric scoring system is based on a weighted combination of 14 variables, in some cases using one or more of them as limiting variables, which I'll explain in a bit. So this is the course screen. I'm not going to really go into the details on this, but it's in the documentation that we have on the website for scoring the non-tidal assessment. These are the 14 that are used for the numeric score, and this is how they're weighted when they're combined together to create a composite score. And then we also use the outlet drop as a limiting variable. So outlet drop, whichever one is smaller, the composite score or the outlet drop score, that's the score that's given to the crossing. So because the outlet drop only makes up 16% of the score of the composite, but can be a complete and total barrier to any kind of movement, we want to make it possible that if you're have an outlet drop that's beyond a certain size, that it basically trumps whatever you get for everything else. This is the searching screen for the database. So you can go in there and you can search based on, what state and what city or town within the state, or you can also search by county. You can search by watershed, and there's all these other things you can search for. There's different data sets that you can search. You can also use this within what we call the Stream Crossing Explorer, which I'll illustrate in a little bit. But once you put in your search criteria, then you can click this button for map results, and it'll bring up the map of that area that you defined in the search. And if all the dots are black, that means that nobody's done any assessments in that area. And so this can be used to help plan your assessments. And so if you zoom in on the map, you'll eventually bring up the crossing codes, and then you can do screen grabs and turn them into maps that you can send to your lead observers to go out in the field and say, these are the ones that you need to do this week. You can then export those as Excel files or shape files. So here are the options that are below where it says map results. You can either download it as a shape file or different levels of detail in Excel reports. Simple, detailed. If you go to an area where there have been assessments done, then you'll see different colored either dots or squares or triangles, depending on what's there. And then you can just click this map information button to get the legend, so you can see what these colors mean. So the more assessments you do, the more useful this map interface is for identifying these really severe barriers that are present within that landscape that you've chosen. And just like with all the black dots, you can zoom in and you can look at the XY codes so that you know what their name is. You can click on any of these and it'll take you directly to the data in the database, and it'll show you the photographs for that crossing, as well as all of the data down here, all the data that were collected as part of that record. And then there's this Stream Crossing Explorer that you can also use to filter the data. And so what you do is check this blue box if you want to use the Stream Crossing Explorer, and that will change the nature of the search panels. You can now search by state, city, town, county, or watershed. And then once you've identified what you want to look at, you can then click the button that says Map with SCE for Stream Crossing Explorer. That'll bring up this panel, which shows you the attributes of crossings that you can select and include within the Stream Crossing Explorer when you do your analysis or do your data filtering. And so of these, some of these come directly from the NAACC database. So the impassability score is the inverse of the numeric score, and the AOP classification is that no AOP, full AOP, or reduced AOP. Structural risk comes from the condition assessment. So if there has been a condition assessment that's done at that structure, there will be a score for risk. And then here you can see the 7 different scores that are available based on the terrestrial assessments, if they've been done.
I have a question on that, Scott.
Yeah.
For the risk of failure, I know if we are not doing the full analysis for the structural risk, if that's not completed yet, does the poor condition influence this at all, or that's not? Okay.
No.
Thanks.
No, it's just the condition, the full condition assessment is what's used. These that are highlighted in green come from the critical linkages analysis that we do at UMass. So essentially from the data and from larger landscape models, we look at the loss of connectivity due to a barrier formed by a crossing. And then we calculate the connectivity restoration potential as that connectivity loss weighted by quality, stream quality, which is based on our assessment of ecological integrity, the landscape scale assessment. We do a cold water version of critical linkages where you can look at the connectivity restoration potential for cold water streams. So how well are they interconnected, either using any of these 4 thresholds for temperature, for mean summer temperature, 16, 18, 20, and 22 degrees Celsius. And then stream order comes from this critical linkages as well. Anadromous restoration potential is for migratory fish, and that comes from the Nature Conservancy's assessment based on their aquatic barriers prioritization tool. These come from EcoSheds, which is a USGS web environment where there's a habitat occupancy model for brook trout, which we call trout habitat suitability. They have stream temperature, and they have or estimated stream temperature, and then they have stream temperature resistance, which is how disconnected is stream temperature from air temperature, which is really important when you consider climate change, because as air temperature warms, we want to note how much is that going to affect the stream temperature, especially for cold water species. And then in some states, they collect data that can be used to calculate a geomorphic risk of failure as well as a hydraulic risk of failure. And so there's opportunities for those data to be included in the SCE, although they're not in there yet. So just to illustrate how you use the SCE to filter your data and identify maybe important candidates for replacement, I'm going to look at just the Massachusetts portion of 3 watersheds that contribute to the Connecticut River, 3 tributaries, Deerfield, Westfield, and Farmington rivers. And you can see all the dots here represent all the different crossings that are in those 3 watersheds. So in the panel, these are the attributes that I selected for this analysis: the impassability score and the AOP classification, the general connectivity restoration potential, and the cold water restoration potential at 16 degrees Celsius. Also looking at trout habitat suitability, stream temperature, and stream temperature resistance. I'm now going to use this charts tool up here in the red circle. And when you click on that, it brings up a panel that you can use to add a chart to this tool. And so in this case, the first attribute that I'm going to look at is stream temperature. So when I add stream temperature to the tool, what it's going to show me is a histogram or a bar graph of the distribution of temperatures for each of the crossings that's shown on the left side in the map. And so in this way, I can either plug numbers into these windows, or I can use the handles on the end of the plot to select a range of temperatures that I want to include and a range of temperatures to exclude. So in this case, I'm excluding all of the warmer water areas and focusing on cold water, crossings on cold water streams. Now, if I go back, and you can see the number of crossings on the left on the map, as soon as I filter it, it starts to drop out crossings that don't meet that criterion. So now I'm going to add 2 more factors. I'm going to add stream temperature resistance. So those are the cold water streams that are likely to stay cold over time, and the cold water restoration potential. So I can filter to just include those crossings that already meet my criteria for temperature, but now must also meet the criteria for resistance. So those highly resistant crossings or crossings on high resistance streams, I've already now dropped the number of crossings from 1,928 to 508. Now I'm going to use the bottom histogram to only look at those where there's high potential for restoring cold water connectivity. And once I've done this filter, I'm now down to just 200 out of what was almost 2,000 crossings. And so this is a way that you can just play around with it. You just use the slider bars back and forth and look at the number of dots that come and go until you get a number that suits your interests. And then you can download these. And you can also, explore a little bit. You can click on any one of these to get what the attribute scores are within the Stream Crossing Explorer. And then this camera tool, if there's a record in the database and you click on that, it'll bring up the data from the NAACC database. So with the photographs and the data and everything else. And then you can download it. So here's the download button in red. And you can download it as a CSV file, which can be turned into an Excel file or imported into a GIS. You can download it as a shape file, or as a GeoJSON file. All right, so now we're getting to the end. I'm just giving you the web addresses again. So streamcontinuity.org to get to our portal site, streamcontinuity.org/NAACC to get to the NAACC program site. And then to the database, you go naacc.org. And in the process, whenever the questions arise, generally what we recommend is that lead observers should take questions to their coordinator. The L1 coordinator will take any questions that they're not fully comfortable with to the L2, and then questions can eventually come to us. But if you have problems, like if you're having problems accessing the site, if you're having problems with the entering data or something like that, you can come to us directly by sending an email to this address, contact@naacc.org. That goes that's monitored by Marie-Francoise, and she looks at the question and decides who's the best person to answer it. She answers a lot of them herself, but if it's something that I should answer, she puts it in my folder. If it's something that Bob should answer, it goes into his folder. And Bob is the person that runs our database. So when it comes to database technical issues, Bob will answer those questions, but it's not always clear right away who should answer what questions. So it's easiest if rather than contacting me directly, you use the contact, because it might be a question that's better answered by Bob. And with that, I will close and offer to answer any questions that you have. I hope this wasn't too tedious and might be of some use, but we want you to, it's sort of like hazing, you know, we want to make sure that you've earned the right to go out and do this work. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording here.